Hey everyone, so in continuing our talks and our lectures and our notes on the biological perspective of psychology, we're going to continue by looking at a concept called localization. Now, before I get into what localization is, we're going to watch a movie real fast. So this first movie, or video clip, I should say, is about the role that the hippocampus plays in memory. So what I want you to do is to watch this 5 minute or so clip, and I want you guys to just sort of think about this, and not only in the context of HM, who we've talked about before in class, but also in terms of what you think localization might mean and what are some of the concepts that you can start to gain in trying to understand this particular concept. So I'll give some time now if you want to pause the note video at this point. All right, now that you've watched the video, we're just going to talk a little bit about Henry Molaison, or HM as he was referred to in the Scoville, Milner, and Corkin studies. But really, when we're talking about localization, we're talking about HM in the context of the role that the hippocampus plays in memory. Because the idea of localization is one of uh, each part of the brain or each locale in the brain having a specific function in terms of not only our bodies uh, working in a certain order, but also in terms of how that might affect behavior. And so in the case of HM, the man who had part of his hippocampus removed and had his memory changed in some way, when we talk about localization, we're really talking about um, the functions that the hippocampus plays for us and how different areas of the brain, in terms of how his memory changed and what he was still able to do with memory, um, how other parts may have taken over some of the responsibilities of his memory, even though other parts like um, not being able to encode most new memories or most new experiences was sort of absent from his life moving forward. So even though we're going to be seeing HM throughout the year in a lot of different contexts, if you were ever to be asked a essay question on localization and HM, you would want to make sure that you're getting into what it says for the conclusion there in terms of this specific area, Brodmann 38, is what made his memory um, so bad in nature, right? That there is a localized role of the hippocampus in encoding new experiences. All right, so now that we've gone into this small definition for localization, I want to go into it a little bit more deeply. So again, localization is the idea that specific areas of the brain have specific functions. And this really represents a classic view of localization that has been somewhat updated over time. We'll talk about how it's been updated and what we now know about localization um, in terms of how the brain works with between parts and as parts that are isolated within the brain. And the main way that we're going to be talking about localization and the context in which we're going to be talking about localization, even though it exists across a number of different contexts in terms of every behavior that you have, is the idea of language. And again, this scenario where if you're writing an essay on localization, writing about language and giving a specific context and a specific lens to which you can uh, write about localization through is going to be really helpful for you. And the reason why we want to talk about language and localization is that much of the available localization research has often focused on the location of language within the brain. Language is extremely important to not only our biological selves and our ability to exist and survive within society, but it's also important in terms of our own cognition, um, and our ability to live in cultures, to succeed in cultures. Even if you think about what's going to make you successful as adults, there aren't a lot of people who are successful in life who can't communicate on any level. And so, if our brains are not operating in a way that would make it uh, enable us to utilize language, we're going to have a lot of problems. So, a few key details about language and localization before we go into a few studies and talk a little bit more about how we've sort of learned from localization. The first one is that the brain is generally localized, and I say generally because it's not certain in all cases. It's generally localized for language in the left hemisphere of your brain, but it's not as localized as we once believed. It was at once believed that the right side of your brain had no sort of part in language. And what we found is that that's not necessarily always the case. Our brains are so adaptive that other parts of the brain can sort of take over for functioning, not only just in terms of language, but in other areas as well, um, should there be an issue within the brain. The right hemisphere of the brain, as we've learned, plays more of a supportive role in language than originally thought, from studying people with abnormal brains. And all we really mean by abnormal is just when it operates outside of the norm of most people. Um, People can live totally um, functioning lives with abnormal brains, but there are different things that uh, have to be taken into consideration. So when we're talking about what is called strict or classic localization, this doesn't necessarily give a full picture. It's rather reductionist or simplified, and many different parts of the brain can oftentimes work together in order to help us function as human beings. And again, like I said on the last slide, classic localization is this belief that um, mental processes are confined to one area of the brain. So, like we talked about with HM, the hippocampus is involved in memory. Now, let's say you are born without a hippocampus, if that were ever to occur. This does not necessarily mean that you could not develop memories in any way. What it really means is that um, over time we've learned that there's more of an interactive approach, and um, so you may have other parts that sort of take over for the processes that the hippocampus would have taken on. However, we found that some sensory processes like smell, touch, taste have been found to be more specific to a particular lobe area part of the brain. Most modern research has, and I hate using this term, but I have it here. It's really sort of um, not shown classical localization, especially with more abstract processes like language. And two areas that were originally found to sort of hold the language and to help us to not only produce sounds, produce language, but also to comprehend the sounds of other people, were Broca's and Wernicke's area. And this is just an example of classic localization. They were researched in the late 19th century, right around the time that psychology started to become an actual science or was respected as a science by Broca and Wernicke. And there were the designation of areas of the brain where specific functions take place in only those areas. So Broca's area is for language production, Wernicke's was for language comprehension. And given the vast amount of research that has been done since Broca and Wernicke, their research is in many ways outdated. Okay, strict localization has been shown to again be a very simplistic view of how the brain actually works. there are other parts of the brain that might take over some of those functions and may work together to produce sound or to comprehend sound. And so the limitations of these ideas of strict localization, not to sort of repeat myself over and over again, but it's very oversimplified. Like we said, some sensory functions may be limited to one area of the brain, but many abstract cognitive functions are only possible with the coordination of many smaller brain regions. And the idea of neuroplasticity, which we're going to be talking about in this unit as well, is that our brains are so adaptable that should there be damage, should there be removal of some part of the brain, they can sort of take over. And so modern research does not support a strict division of localization such as that we see in classic localization. All right, so in terms of studies of localization, um, modern research into localization of language, our example for today, has found that environmental conditions can also influence the development of the brain. So it's not just biological factors or genetic factors that may, influence the development of our brains. And the first of the studies that we're going to see in just a second here uh, studied the shepherds in the Canary Islands who used a whistle language known as Silbo Gamero to communicate over long distances with other shepherds. And this is a whistle language. And so it's going to work differently than a spoken word language in a lot of ways. So the study that had this was Carrerias et al. From 2005. And when we talk about the term et al., this may be a repeat of something I've said in the past, but et al. Just means that there's more than one researcher. And so it's going to be important for you guys to use et al. Because you don't want to sort of disrespect the work of these other researchers who have been sort of coupled together. So this is a quasi-experiment. So it sort of put people into categories, not randomly, but by the factor of the features of their particular language. And so the aim of this was to discover whether the whistle language was also processed in the left hemisphere, the left temporal and inferior frontal lobes, and to see if the brains of Silbo users differed from the brains of non-Silbo users. Those that used whistled languages versus those who used more traditional spoken languages. And so the procedure, they had Silbadors and non-users have a fMRI done of their brain while completing 2 tasks. So the baseline scan was done while they passively listened to Silbo and Spanish that were compared to reversed Silbo sentences. So how were they comprehending the spoken word? And then active attention to see how this changed. They listened actively to Silbo and Spanish sentences mixed with silent periods. And so what they found through the results, the brains of skilled Silbo whistlers in both tasks used parts of the left hemisphere associated with speech production. When they used both Spanish and Silbo, these whistlers also showed an activation of the right hemisphere of the brain. This was consistent with other bilingual research. And so Silbo speakers really sort of differed in how they spoke as compared to people who only spoke Spanish or English or German or whatever language you were to compare it to. And so the brain does not become as localized as original research suggested. If the Silbo users had a strictly localized brain, they would have really never used the right hemisphere of the brain for language. So in terms of bilingualism, and we talked about this a little bit with the last study from Carrerias et al., but bilingualism and localization, the more that the brain has been studied, especially with bilingual speakers, the more that they've sort of shown that the role of the second language learning has revealed possible arguments that the brain reacts differently to language in people who speak bilingually or speak two languages than those who speak only one language. And this really connects to neuroplasticity. How do we store and remember language, and how do we sort of translate between those two languages that are occurring sometimes at once for very skilled bilingual speakers? So the neural pathways of the brain change based on the individual learning two languages before the age of 6 compared to those who know just one language. So this isn't necessarily true for those like you guys, some of you who are learning second language after the age of 6. In many cases, your brain will still look very similar to those who are monolingual. We're talking specifically about those who learn their second language before the age of 6. So this leads us into another study here, Hull and Vaid from 2006. So really what they were studying was that bilinguals and the language localization variance. They want to see how brains differ in terms of where language is localized between those who speak two languages and those who speak one. And this was a meta-analysis, and this is something that we haven't quite talked about before, but this is a study of many studies. And so Hull and Vaid really just compiled a bunch of different studies together to see what they said and to sort of compile research which would bring us to a solid understanding of the available research out there. And so they really, by doing this meta-analysis, sort of create new data. They sort into more comparable studies into categories and then analyze the effect sizes of these studies to draw conclusions about the data and teach us more, in this case, about the localization of language, especially within bilingual speakers. So they examined 23 studies of normal monolingual and bilingual participants. They wanted to discover under which conditions second language experiences affected brain development. And so they had 4 hypotheses. The first one, bilinguals use more of the right brain. Number 2, skilled bilinguals are more right brain lateralized. And so they're more organized, or the language that they speak can oftentimes differentiate their orientation compared to other speakers. Number 3, closer in time two languages are acquired, the more similar the brain localization. So learning the second language before the age of, say, 6 is very critical. And then the fourth one, early stages of learning a language depends largely on contextual cues, which are localized in the right hemisphere. So if you're trying to learn two languages at once, you're using all these different cues, which are stored in the right side of the brain. And so language oftentimes takes another tact in terms of it being also localized in the right hemisphere as well. So the results of their study really supported the first and second hypothesis. So what they found was that early experience of learning language was most important to localization of learning language. So the first point that they found out, mono and bilinguals who learned their second language after age 6 really showed very similar brain patterns. They showed a left hemisphere dominance. However, early bilinguals ended up becoming bilateral in terms of using both hemispheres of the brain, which supported that first hypothesis. So the most important point I want you guys to get out of today's talk about localization is that oftentimes the brain or the parts of the brain do not sort of exist in isolation. Oftentimes they work together in order to produce a very or as stable a life as possible for you, to allow you to make sense of the world around you as easily as possible. If you have any questions on this, please contact me. Please let me know. Get in touch with me. And I hope you all have a great day. All right, bye.